Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissonance. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Apologies in advance for my voice on this podcast and in the next couple of episodes. The baby has RSV. I probably have RSV. Who knows? When you have a kid in daycare, apparently you just get sick with everything else in the world. Joining me on the podcast is Hafsa Halawa. She's the founder and director of Zircon Consultancy in Dubai. I reached out to Hafsa on Twitter, and she was nice enough to agree to come on the podcast. I thought this was a really excellent conversation. We've gone away from the Israeli-Palestinian content recently, but we're getting another big swell of that content for you. And I think Hafsa also did a very good job. I mean, you probably came for the Israeli-Palestinian content, but stay for the content on Sudan, on Egypt, and Ethiopia, just as, if not more important, and Hafsa was incredibly insightful. Last programming note for me, as last week, this week I'm traveling at the end of the week. Rob and I will be recording early Friday morning and then posting ASAP. So you'll still get your Friday episode from us, but it'll be a couple hours later than you are accustomed to. So if it's not there, don't freak out. Some of you freaked out last week. Sorry about that, but also tickled to know that people have come to depend on that for your Friday morning routine. Email me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you want to talk about how we manage money for clients, if you want to be a client, if you want access to our research, or if you just want to suggest someone for the podcast or have a comment. Thank you, by the way, if you've left comments recently. We've had a groundswell of them, and it really helps us move up the charts and get more visibility for the podcast. So really appreciate that. And if you haven't left a comment or review, please consider doing so. Enough ado from me. Cheers and see you out there. All right, well, Hafsa, thank you so much for making the time to join us and for responding to a random inquiry on Twitter or X or whatever the hell we're supposed to call it these days. We're recording November 7th. We will get this out tomorrow. We're not going to sit on it just because the things we're talking about are moving so fast. But I can't believe it's been a month since this awfulness started between Israel and Palestine. So I don't even know where to start there. What do you think is going to happen next? What's going to happen in the next week? What's the next day? I mean, as we take stock of a month of tragedy so far, sort of where are you thinking this is going to go from here?
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for your persistence on X. Apologies for not replying the first time. But the fear is that the worst case scenarios that a few of us in this space, and certainly myself with my own thoughts, have been thinking about are slowly coming true. And that being that this is not just a long, prolonged incursion into Gaza or a war in Gaza, but that there's a very existential feeling both for the Arabs and Palestinians and also for the Israelis. And that being that, both for Netanyahu, but also for the right elements of his government, that it's, now is the moment to capitalize on what was a horrific terrorist attack, no doubt, and absolutely just absolute carnage. It was, still seeing new stuff and new news emerging about it was absolutely awful. But at the same time, using this war in Gaza and aggression in the West Bank, accelerating this for possibly, in a worst case scenario, full-on annexation of as much of the territories as possible, such as to make the cause for Palestinian statehood, dead on arrival, dead on the ground. And for the Palestinians and wider region, the Arabs around, the same kind of feeling that this is, what Hamas did was so big in that sense that it's sort of a now or never stance, or the last stand kind of thing. I mean, there are a number of ways that this can de-escalate, and the hope is that it would de-escalate. But we do appear to be on a trajectory, at least in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian question, of the point of no return, really.
Yeah. For me, the worst case, and putting aside sort of the human feelings of this, I mean, the other worst case scenario here is this becomes a regional war and we get Iran and we get all these other things coming in. Do you think that is still on the table, or have we narrowed the worst case scenarios to, okay, now this is really an Israeli-Palestinian affair and we have to work out the worst case scenarios in that bilateral relationship, but most actors in the region, they're angry for different reasons and different actors and all these other things, but it doesn't look like anyone wants to get involved really. Do you still think there's a chance for broader regional conflagration, or is that a little less present?
I think as time goes on, the risk of it is, on the one hand, we can argue the risk is diminishing. On the other, we do see significant escalation day by day on the northern Israeli, southern Lebanese border. So and after yesterday's, I think it was yesterday's attack or the day before on civilians in southern Lebanon, which will have to, or we expect some kind of Hezbollah response in retaliation to that. The sense still is in the region that there'll be no major escalation unless Israel kind of acts out of bounds and sort of takes that fight to them in that sense. And that's definitely the message that seems to be being sent from Tehran. But at the same time, there are different theaters where where tensions are running so high that any kind of small escalation could lead to something bigger. I'm thinking here of Iraq, Syria, obviously Lebanon. And I think there's a misconstrued or a misconception of how U.S. strength in the region is being perceived. I think there's some argument to be said that it looks more aggressive rather than deterrence than maybe the United States intends. And we know that the U.S. is engaged with Israel. It's supporting Israel. There's drone activity over the Gaza Strip. This is becoming more and more a question of how much is the U.S. involved, and by extension, how much will the region choose to react. But I think the risk is still very much there. And the sort of balancing act is, as this war continues and Israel has shown no signs that it wants to retreat, engage in a ceasefire, that threat actually grows rather than diminishes, even though we have a relatively, stable or shall we say very unstable but relative agreement of détente at the moment. Nevertheless, I do think that this scale of civilian casualties in Gaza is likely to force the hand of the United States to call for some kind of ceasefire arrangement sooner rather than later, which will change the dynamics.
Yes, although I'm not sure Israel is going to listen, but we'll get to that in the United States in a second, because the United States foreign policy, they're partying like it's 1973, and it's not 1973. I don't really know what they're doing, but we'll get to that in a second. I noticed, you talked about those different, but you talked about those different theaters. The Houthis have been popping up their heads. Everyone, they fire a rocket this way. Apparently the first space-based battle history will record, it was between the Houthis and Israel. I did not have that on my bingo card. But they also apparently, had a little clash with the Saudis too. And 4 Saudi soldiers died last week in a firefight. It's the first Saudi soldiers that have died since the truce in the Yemen civil war. So I guess the question I'm leading up there, because before I want to get into Israel and Palestinian views and things like that, but the Saudis have been relatively quiet from my perspective. They sort of froze normalization, but not formally, and they're sort of strident, but not really. Now you've got some Saudi soldiers dying in a Houthi conflict, so maybe the Iran thing is poking up there. How do you think Saudi Arabia is dealing with all of this?
Well, I think broadly speaking in the Gulf, in terms of the sort of Israel-Palestine question, the threats of regional war, from the Arab perspective, they're very much letting Egypt and Jordan lead on the messaging, on the diplomacy, on that kind of advocacy perspective. It is a very unified Arab position vis-a-vis the Palestinians, no mass displacement, ceasefire, and aid and so forth. But of course, the biggest risk of this expanding, becoming a broader regional configuration between the broader axis of resistance, as it were, is in the Gulf vis-a-vis Yemen. And we've had a stable sort of agreement of cessation of hostilities in Yemen for some time. The Saudis have been engaged in talks, and actually the bedrock of Saudi-Iranian reconciliation or rapprochement initially was fundamentally rooted in Yemen and finding a solution in Yemen. I still don't believe that there is a real desire from the Houthi side to restart that kind of conflict with Saudi Arabia. Of course, sometimes these warnings, these, reminders of who is in the region and who's there can create accidental I don't want to use the word collateral damage, but they can, fall out of hand and create situations that raise alarm bells. But the fact that these parties are quiet and remain quiet does show a level of commitment that they don't want to escalate things further, and they don't want to see this become taking us back to 2016, 17 kind of times in that area. At the same time, I think that the Gulf-Iran relations have remained quite, the channels of communication are open. These parties are talking to each other at heads of state level and beyond. And, the message seems to be well received in the Gulf that the Iranians don't want this to become any kind of direct confrontation with them. But this is all different forms of reminding both the Gulf countries and Israel that they are there, that they, ideologically stand against what is happening, but not necessarily to the extent that they will, choose to fight Hamas's war. And this still, the messaging from Nasrallah, the messaging that we've seen across the board from the Iraqi Hashd al-Sha'bi, from the Iranians, is that this is very much Hamas's war.
Yeah, well, we'll get to that sort of presently, but before we get to the Hamas perspective,
there's so many qualifications to every single sentence. I mean, there's like 3 other things going on in my head that I should have qualified that with, but never mind.
Well, I mean, that's why this is my least favorite topic to talk about, because you have to issue 5 different qualifications for everything you say. You're going to get in trouble. So I've just accepted that people aren't going to like me, and I just talk about what I'm going to talk about. But for better and for worse. On that Israeli perspective, I mean, Israel seems to be, and I understand why, suffering from sort of shell shock and post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's all coming out in sort of weird ways. But I saw that Netanyahu said, we're recording on the 7th here, so he said it today, that, he expected the IDF would be in charge of Gaza's security indefinitely, was the word that he used. And I couldn't help but think in my head, does Netanyahu think he's going to be prime minister indefinitely too? But it seems really strange, because we've seen this movie before. Israel tried this in Lebanon in the early 80s. It blew up in their face. It led to the creation of Hezbollah. They don't have they have a very, very strong military. They don't have an occupying force like this. Their economy is already sort of, I won't say in shambles, but it's buckling underneath the pressure of calling up, 18% of the working population is now in the reserve or fighting or things like that. It just doesn't seem to me like Israel necessarily has clear objectives here. And I think that is the one U.S. response that has been right. Like, you guys don't have a clear, definable military objective, and you're using the military to try and create political outcomes. So do you have a more rosy interpretation of Israeli strategic thinking, or do you think it's similarly just they're acting out? Or I don't know. I can't quite figure out what the goal is, because I thought the goal would have been shock and awe, knock out as much of Hamas as you can, maybe knock out some Hezbollah while you're at it, get the hostages and go home. And that's not what they're saying their goal is right now.
Well, if you know me better, Jacob, you know that I'm the last person to come to for rosy pictures. So, apologies in advance. But
Cheers.
I mean, 2 things that I think from what you said, and I agree, but to pick up on, I mean, US policy would be well served to actually heed their own message and not jump straight in with a partner that doesn't actually have a military objective and doesn't have a military plan. I mean, we would have been well served 10 days ago, 20 days ago, if this kind of messaging from the US was clearer, and in terms of their actions as well. I mean, now we're at a point where, does it really matter if the US and Israel don't have a military plan? I mean, look at the carnage that has been wrought already. Look at where we're at. Israel's now stuck in a quagmire because it can't withdraw with no hostages, and this was very evident, I think, from the first couple of days that, the language that was coming out of not just Netanyahu, but the government and other officials around it, or former officials, the defense minister, IDF, etc., was the language very much of a revenge agenda. That, the comments at the beginning, flatten Gaza, completely, dispel it, completely empty it, all this kind of language. This is arguably, take them at their word. That's the military objective. Then that's the military objective. Is it impossible? Yes. But there are certain things that Israel can try to make a fait accompli on the ground. One is putting so much pressure on the neighbors and causing so much carnage inside the Gaza Strip that, for example, Egypt has to open its borders and allow as many Palestinians as possible to flee across the border into Egypt. These kinds of things were very clear messages sent by the Israeli government that they wanted to achieve. And whether that be militarily reoccupy Gaza, whether that be militarily reoccupied and reinstall settlements, this is, for Netanyahu, this is his legacy. He either goes down as the prime minister who oversaw and was responsible for October 7th and the security lapses that afforded such a huge Hamas result, as it were, such a huge toll at the hands of Hamas, or he pushes forward on the broader project of, extinguishing the Palestinian cause. And when you compare not just what we're seeing in Gaza, but you take what we're seeing in the West Bank as well, this massive escalation in Jewish extremist settler dispossession, violence. I have friends whose families in the West Bank have not left the house in 3 weeks because settlers move in at night and indiscriminately start shooting. So they're terrified to leave the house at any point of the day or night. That's how precarious the situation is. And, ministers, IDF, settlers are being given free rein. And as this escalates, Netanyahu is not going to pull out and know that what awaits him is, a political chopping block, right? Like, his career is over. And everybody kind of knows that. And to some level, I'm sure Netanyahu himself knows that. So how do you prolong this? How do you, reach an unattainable military objective? How do you portray this as a victory? I'm not quite sure. Clearly, the military will reoccupy all the way up to the Wadi Gaza, just south of Gaza City. And, that area will remain occupied for as long as they can afford it, for as long as, this urban warfare remains a broadly supported agenda by the Israeli public. Yes, we've seen small-scale protests inside Israel, but ultimately, something I think is lost in the conversation is not only how much support there is for this agenda in Gaza, for this military incursion in Gaza, but also how far to the right Israeli public generally has shifted in particularly the last decade or so, but beyond that as well. And that's playing into this, the bigger question, and why the Arab states and the Palestinians feel this is so existential is because, well, if Netanyahu is removed, what's to say that something worse doesn't come in his place all the same? There's absolutely no guarantees that you're going to get some kind of political leadership that takes us back to a space, be it Oslo, be it pre-Oslo, post-73, where there is room for peace or there is room to resurrect the two-state solution.
Yeah, so November 4th is the anniversary of Yitzhak Rabin's assassination, which at least in my household was always treated as a very somber day, and is in many places, I think, and not just in the Israeli community, but in the Jewish community in general. I've also been thinking a lot about Ariel Sharon recently, because for all of his sort of weird things and negative connotations, he was the one who had the IDF drag Israeli settlers out of the Gaza Strip. I remember the videos in 2005. The videos then weren't of, Hamas killing women and children. It's the IDF dragging women and children out of the Gaza Strip. Can you imagine that happening today? And in some sense, I think the space was lost, that the Israeli demographic moment where peace was possible, maybe that moment is just gone. I'm going to ask you a completely unrealistic hypothetical question, but I think it actually is a good question, which is, what is stopping Israel from just saying, okay, let's go back to 73 or 67. Egypt, you take over the Gaza Strip, and Jordan, you take over the West Bank. We're going to keep Jerusalem. That's not on the table, but you guys take those two things. You want to get a pathhood to independent stateship, that's fine. You guys do what you want, but we're out. We don't want to occupy anything. We want nothing to do with this. We want to go back to the way it was before. Why? I know why that's unrealistic.
No,
but
I think I would ask. I would ask you why is the alternative? And I agree with you. I don't think that the demographic space is there in Israel at this present point, and certainly two states seems further away than ever. But for example, one of the, I wouldn't call it silver lining, that's a horrible thing to say, but opportunities from conflict like this that has arisen, I think certainly broadly speaking in the Palestinian space and in the small parts of the Israeli space and across the Arab region, the Arab states region, is that, we went through a period the last few years where two states became, immaterial, the idea of two states just became like, evergreen suggestion, and it wasn't really real on the ground. And everyone started talking about one state solution. We started talking about Palestinian rights, not the Palestinian cause. And I do think that has changed in the last 30 days, that we are now talking fundamentally about two states. And we are talking about somehow creating the building blocks to give Palestinians their statehood. In terms of the roles of Egypt and Jordan, I mean, firstly, it's completely unrealistic because Palestine doesn't survive as a state if it doesn't have strong relations with its neighbors. And Israel as well continues and will continue to be insecure unless it has good relations with its neighbors, being, not just Egypt and Jordan, but a future Palestinian state. So I think the starting point is wrong. And at the same time, we're further away than ever, I think, from peace. There's all kinds of different debates happening behind closed doors. I mean, some people even raising the question of, is Oslo the worst thing? Was Oslo the worst thing that ever happened to the two-state solution trajectory and process? And, it's a debate, but the interesting thing is that everybody's now talking about this, and it's something that has been confined to those who are very invested in it, those who are particularly specialized in, or research or policy work in this particular question of the Palestinian cause and statehood and the occupation. And for the first time, you now have a broader plethora of voices that are looking and seeking different ways, different solutions. I think there are certain things, however, that are the outcome of this conflict right now. One is the US is no longer an honest broker. It can no longer be the guarantor of peace. It can no longer be the guarantor of a Palestinian state. It will, in terms of, getting us there, reaching us there. The last time we had a so-called peace process, John Kerry, for all of his efforts, didn't even consult with the Palestinians while he was engaging with the Israelis and consulting on what a peace deal would look like, let alone moving to then the Jared Kushner, Palestine doesn't exist peace initiative that he launched. And, what I do hear emerging across the region is, the Arab states stepping up and the Arab states needing to step up. And I think that's come not only from an acknowledgement of the fact that nobody is safer without, solving this, 75-year-long crisis. At the same time, the US no longer has the kind of standing that allows them to be the convener, mediator, or guarantor. And I think what may possibly emerge from this is a mix of those countries that have normalized relations or have peace treaties with Israel being the driving force between getting this back on the table. But there are other questions as well that we need to look at, or other things we need to acknowledge, not just the Israeli politics that we discussed, but the fact that for all intents and purposes, the Palestinian Authority has no legitimacy and effectively is dead. Let's be honest about this. Mahmoud Abbas will die at some point in the next few years. He's 87. He's in ailing health. He is not, doesn't look after himself particularly well. And with his death, probably the formation, this idea of the PLO-PA possibly dies with it. So we also have to think about, as all these partners together that want to reach a solution whereby Israelis and Palestinians do live in peace and do live in security and do live in two states side by side, is that we need to look for new actors, new leaders, new organized, new movements. How do we reinvigorate Palestinian politics? And, I'm tired, to be quite frank, of listening to disingenuous American politicians talk about a two-state solution when for the last 11 years, not one US politician has gone on the record to say the Palestinians have the right to self-determination, or we support the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. That was extinguished to the latter end of Obama's leadership, and Trump never said it, nor did his administration. And under Biden, it has never been uttered. We do have statements of a two-state solution to now hold people accountable to, but we still have not reached the point where this administration is ready to actively go on the record and say, we believe in the self-determination of Palestinian people. And what the US and Israel and others, I think, sometimes miss is that across the region, all of these statements and incidents and messages get sort of stored, and then they get regurgitated when there's escalation in violence. So, everywhere now, if you follow sort of different Instagram accounts and Arab Instagram, it's not just what's happening in Gaza. It's not just what's happening in the West Bank. It's Shireen Abu Akleh. It's Sheikh Jarrah in 2021. It's pictures of the war in 2014. This keeps getting resurrected. And as much as the messages may have shifted from the West and from the US in particular in the last 4 or 5 days, what's getting repeated is what was said on the first day, on the second day, on the third day, this absolute right to self-defense. Biden questioning the numbers of those who've been killed in Gaza, for example. This stuff gets, recycled and fuels more and more anger and more sentiment against the West in particular, but also Israel to an extent.
Yeah, I very rarely speak about my own political views ever publicly. But I will make an exception for Jared Kushner, because people have been asking me, oh, did you see that podcast that he was on? Isn't he so much smarter than you thought? That slimy little charlatan, we can lay most of the blame, I will lay most of the blame at his feet for how U.S. foreign policy has gone off track here in the Middle East, because he was the architect behind, he remade everything, and everything that's going on in the Middle East, at least from a U.S. perspective. Thank you, Jared Kushner, for your help. No, he's not smart. Stop listening to him and stop watching that podcast.
I mean, definitely. And I completely agree. I can't remember what movie character he reminds me of. It's something like Hannibal Lecter means, I don't know, something from Haunted, whatever.
I think that's an insult to Hannibal Lecter, but let's not dwell.
But I will say this. Anthony Blinken has done nothing to roll back what Jared Kushner put in place. In fact, he's doubled down on it and chosen to implement this, idea of economic rights or economic support for the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. And that is as much an unconscionable policy as the Kushner plan was in the first place.
Yeah. I want to talk about the Palestinian perspective before we look at some other conflicts in the region, because there are those conflicts there. And I guess I want to delineate it between Hamas and between the Palestinian people. And you may want to delineate it differently or tell me that there are more factions, or maybe it's all Hamas. I don't know. But in some ways, maybe we just start with Hamas, because my take here on Hamas is that they didn't expect to have this much success. And when they had the success that they did, they sort of went off the rails, which you can't excuse it. You can understand why a people with that ideology who have been isolated for that long would commit atrocities. It's terrible. Like they're feeling the wrath of it right now. But the easy way to end this war is release the hostages. If you release the hostages tomorrow, support for Israel dries up immediately, and probably the Israeli electorate turns to Netanyahu and says, okay, you're done. Like, your time is over. I assume Hamas doesn't want to do that because Hamas wants the war and is the only actor here that wants the war. I assume the Palestinian people don't want this war. But maybe talk to me because you already talked about how moribund the Palestinian Authority is. And I don't know about Abbas. Maybe he can live forever. I've been hearing for a decade that he was close to death. He's still around.
Fair.
So
he's still around.
Help me break that down.
I think I know a few friends who've rewritten that obituary several times over the years, waiting for its release. But I think so. Yes, of course, there is Hamas. There are other militant factions like Palestinian Jihad as well in the mix. Of course, there is a vast difference. And I think also within that delineation, to acknowledge that there are a number of civilian bureaucrats who have run Gaza, who are nominally Hamas, in the same way that, there was millions of Ba'ath Party members under the Saddam regime, in order to get a job in schools or in whatever institution, or have roles in the government. They were members, and there'll be a sliding scale in terms of what is the kind of political wing of Hamas and the militant sort of, not just Qassam brigades, but the militant side of it. And those people certainly don't want to give up. The militant wing certainly doesn't want to give up on conflict now. However, I think there is a breaking point on all sides. And I think, if you sort of speak to the Qataris or listen to the Qataris, the recent escalation in the airstrikes has stalled what they were calling very positive movement on negotiations regarding the hostages. And there's been, I think, a shift. And I think this is where the Israeli public comes into play, because, Hamas's offer is hostages for quote unquote prisoners, those being the at least 1,000 Palestinians held without any charge, most of them women and minors in the West Bank. And really sort of seeking, and I think the meeting with Netanyahu with some of the families of the hostages did come out, and they did call for an everyone for everyone kind of swap in that sense, to release all the hostages and have these Palestinian prisoners released. I think in the end, we get to somewhere like that. Hamas at this stage in the conflict isn't going to support a ceasefire if it doesn't have anything to show for it. 1,000, 2,000 prisoners released will be something for them. The question for them and for Israel as well is a ceasefire, and then what? If they've occupied, are they going to retreat? Is this a 2014 retreat after sort of 30 days, or 51 days was the length of the war? And there, I think, is the disconnect, because you have the Qataris saying that negotiations are moving along, the Egyptians as well, those groups that are interlocutors with all sides of the both parties. At the same time, you have this messaging coming from Hamas, which is mixed. You've got the military actors sending messages every now and then. You've got the political wing sort of saying, from Qatar, saying their piece, certainly more inclined to agree to a ceasefire. And then you have the Israeli public messaging from Netanyahu, which is, we've had biblical references, we've had incredibly, ministers claiming that it's, a possibility to nuke the Gaza Strip, for example. And this stuff doesn't give anybody confidence that, not just that the war will end anytime soon, but I go one step further and ask, who's negotiating in good faith at this point on both sides? Can we honestly say that on both sides there's any effort for good faith negotiations vis-a-vis the hostages, vis-a-vis, the question of Hamas's asks and prisoners on the other side? And these things always end, and peace processes begin with confidence building measures. There has to be something for something. And yes, admittedly, this began with an atrocity committed by Hamas, and some may argue that, they have no right to ask for anything. But, if we're looking at the wider sort of question of, let's say how we got here over the last 16, but certainly 30 years, having over 1,000 Palestinian minors and women arrested and detained without charge is, unacceptable. It's an illegally occupying power, and it shouldn't be allowed. There are certain, there are laws and there are rules, and there will be people who say, no, we should have our prisoners, our citizens released, our civilians released. So, all of that is to say that neither side wins with this current level of carnage. There's been all this different kind of polling and how popular Hamas was before October 7th, and then it spiked and it surged, and now it's, at the end of the day, asking Palestinians in Gaza right now who they support or what they want to see, this is a population of which some 50% weren't even, are under 18, so have barely known anything but this blockade and this life that they've lived in Gaza. The vast majority of them have never left the Strip. And the rest, have been, I know people who've rebuilt their houses several times. And in fact, one person that I know had just moved back into a house following the 2021 bombing in September, and then had to move and has been displaced 3 times and is now in the south, staying amongst other people in Khan Yunis. So, we're at the point of a ceasefire now. What does it even look like? Okay, we get a ceasefire, there's the bombing stops, and, the injured start to trickle out into Egypt to be treated. We stop having these numbers every day, these videos pouring out, things start to slow down in that sense. But then ultimately, everything else just stops. There's going to be no rebuilding of North Gaza, certainly. I would argue probably most of southern Gaza. Israel, may or may not continue the siege of electricity, fuel, water, food. If they militarily occupy up until the sort of the Wadi Gaza, where do these million people who've been displaced, thereabouts, go? What do they do? Where do they go? How do we feed them? How do we support them? And actually here, if your listeners are interested, Nathan Brown, who is, one of the foremost experts on this topic, wrote a fantastic piece over the weekend for the Carnegie Endowment about the day after. And, to paraphrase his words, he says Gaza will turn into the largest IDP camp in the world. And I think that thinking, those lines are where we see this heading. And that only continues to create instability and insecurity, because if you do get a ceasefire under those conditions, the tunnels still remain, Hamas is weakened, but still there, no major movement on 2 states or on any kind of state, and security threats to Egypt and Israel then persist, especially if we continue the siege and blockade in this fashion. And arguably the only way out of this that isn't complete blackness, black hole kind of worst case scenarios, is to genuinely and actively seek to restart the peace process.
It just feels like it's going to end like all the other ones, that the Palestinians are going to get screwed. The Israelis will buy a modicum more security at the cost of their soul, and the rest of the region will go back to doing whatever it is they do when things aren't active.
I challenge that. I was in Cairo last week. I've been around the Gulf. I'm traveling around the Gulf as well the rest of the month. And it really feels, and speaking also to friends in Jordan and Lebanon in particular, it really feels like something has changed forever. Like, there is a before October 7th and an after October 7th. And it really feels like, this is tectonic, shift that we're seeing. I don't know if that's going to be in a positive or negative direction. I think we're all entertaining scenarios on a wishful thinking side and a, what is the worst possible thing you can imagine happening kind of side. But yeah, definitely forever changed.
All right. Well, on that rosy note, let's go to more rosy things. The Sudanese civil war has been going on, since April? Over 10,000 dead, over 5 million displaced. I think most people don't even know what's going on with Sudan. So maybe give the listeners just sort of what is going on in the Sudanese civil war and why should they care?
Unfortunately, the war has only escalated in recent months, This all came out of, obviously, the protests that removed Omar al-Bashir from power in 2019 and then ushered in this, what was hailed at the time as this sort of civilian military mix of a transitional council. And, lo and behold, surprise, surprise, when the military's turn came to give up power and cede power to the civilians, they staged a coup. And the military has long had this independent artery militia group, the Rapid Support Forces, that enforced and were responsible. They were the former Janjaweeds, responsible for the war in Darfur 20 years ago. And it's these 2 factions mainly that have been fighting for the last 6 months. The RSF, led by by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, Hemeti, and the Sudanese armed forces led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. And what we've seen in the last 2-3 months since August is the armed forces effectively cede control of Khartoum, the capital, where a lot of the most violent fighting was occurring. So over the last 6 months, the fighting has been quite not centered, but it's been in Khartoum and some surrounding areas, Khartoum Twin Cities, and in Darfur states. And very much a sort of what's been called an ethnic cleansing campaign by the RSF in Darfur, the 4 Darfur states. And since the SAF, the armed forces effectively gave up Khartoum, the RSF has been expanding its control, not just in Khartoum, but in the neighboring states and suburbs, and is looking to move further south as well. The army has retreated to the east, which has remained. There's no fighting there in terms of this kind of confrontation, and then we've had really just the most horrific, brutal violence in Darfur. And what we've seen in the last few weeks is the RSF claim victory and take the capitals of East, West, and North. There's fighting in El Fasher in North Darfur, Northern Darfur. Niala, Jiniana, and just, not just massacres on a mass scale, but I think certainly speaking to my Sudanese friends and colleagues and the experts who are much better versed than I am on this, the level of violence since this war broke out, most of it, not all, but most of it at the hands of the RSF, the sexual violence, the brutal personal violence, the randomness of it has really shaken Sudanese society. I think, we have the highest amount of displaced people in any conflict in the world at the moment in Sudan. Millions of people have fled Khartoum, a city of 5 million, on approximately 5 to 6 million, has been, not emptied, but certainly millions have fled. Darfur, we've had hundreds of thousands flee across the border into Chad. The fighting is continuing, and now we're at a really critical juncture where the RSF feels emboldened and certainly feels strong enough to go forward and claim full military victory over the Sudanese armed forces. And Hemeti has issued statements and messages that show some intent that he intends to strike the army in the east. Most crucial for that is Port Sudan is in the east, and Port Sudan is Sudan's artery of its trade. It is a large Red Sea port. It's 300 kilometers from Saudi Arabia, approximately from Port Jeddah, and it also serves as the artery by which South Sudanese oil is sold, leaves the continent. And Sudan is affectionately in the Gulf called the breadbasket of the region. It has not just, you may have heard, an abundance of gold and other properties, but it also has some of the largest, the most arable land and in East Africa. And currently you have these Gulf countries who import their alfalfa for their dairy companies from Brazil, from Portugal, parts of Siberia, even with climate change. And, it is a gift for them to see Sudan Sudan's agriculture become accessible to them. So you do have some broader or some more granular intra-Gulf competition playing out. Broadly speaking, the RSF is backed by the UAE, and the SAF has been until now backed by Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and some other nominal parties. But we're seeing Egyptian support weaken, not necessarily in terms of diverting to the RSF, but really sort of a case of, they don't have any money or weapons to send in this fight. And there's a sense in Cairo really of, well, if the SAF can't hold their own, why should we help them? If they can't seem to beat this group or even put up a real fight. And we've seen recently images of the RSF just really kind of, taking these cities incredibly easily, almost no response, no fight back. We're seeing SAF soldiers flee into Chad. There really is a sense that SAF is just abandoning this, which is kind of terrifying. At the same time, Sudan is a huge country. It's I think the second or the youngest population in the region, which is already the youngest region in the world. Average age in Sudan is about 19 years, 3 months, I think,
Wow.
Something like that. It is one of the fastest growing populations in the region. Egypt and Sudan together make approximately 37% of the MENA region's population. That's expected to climb to somewhere in the region of 45% by 2050. 2030, 2050, I don't know. But it's insane. Like there's there will be, it will be huge. We can scratch that out and edit that out.
No, it's good.
That's okay. Not here. At the same time, Sudan is, strategically located on the Red Sea. It is tantamount to Red Sea security, and also, of course, wider Horn politics and regional politics. Ethiopia, Eritrea, obviously, of course, Somalia, Djibouti. All of these countries are vulnerable to the continued fallout of this war. And primarily, to conclude, the RSF has no legitimacy and no constituency on the ground. So even if they are to claim a military victory and install a puppet president like someone, the former Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, and members of the FFC who are loyal to, or not loyal, but have shown allegiance or loyalty to the RSF, that doesn't create stability. That doesn't create a trajectory where Sudan stabilizes. Quite the opposite. It opens up massive, risks of insurgency, militancy, security threats. There's still no question on what happens to the army. Some people have suggested they sort of fold into the RSF and that becomes the new army. There's an Islamist history in Sudan. What happens to these Islamist actors, factions, tribes, big armed tribal groups? I mean, some people are talking about fragmentation as, a foregone conclusion. Some are still debating whether that's 2 states, up to 5 states. Whatever the trajectory is, I think that, after April 15th, Sudan does not go back to, a one fully functional state again. And that will be very, very dangerous for its neighbors, for the Red Sea, for the Gulf countries and partners. And unfortunately, nobody seems to have policy solutions or answers to this crisis. We've had the US on the wrong side of this since the very beginning. They've never supported a real civilian track meaningfully. They've never engaged on doubling down after the coup and sanctioning or threatening that military trajectory. They put us on a path to this conflict along with other partners like the UAE and others who endorsed this framework agreement in January that had already split the military and the RSF and the civilians. And there was a misbelief a very poor misbelief that Hemeti and Burhan were in this together against the civilians. And they never were. It was convenience. And, for many people, this was predictable. They predicted this as early as 2019, that this kind of confrontation was coming. And unfortunately, very few chose to heed the warnings.
Yeah, I know 1 or 2 lonely voices in the U.S. who are trying to push U.S. foreign policy in the right direction, but I don't think that they got through in the end. I'm struck by, for Egypt, just everything seems to be going wrong on all sides. We have Gaza to the north. We have Libya. We have Sudan. We have Ethiopia's damming the Nile River. It just looks like, there's a catastrophe. I understand how it affects the Gulf. This is probably a big loss for Saudi Arabia. But man, things just, and we haven't even talked about Sisi's going to elections and the Egyptian economy is in tatters. Is Egypt next? Because
Yes,
Egypt looks like a basket case, and I don't see how it avoids any of these.
It definitely does. And, Egypt does benefit from one thing. It is an incredibly, broadly speaking, 90s, even between the different faiths, it is an incredibly homogeneous society. This is not a society that has a history. We have a history of marginalization, obviously, of the Coptic Christians in particular, Jewish community back in the 50s. But broadly speaking, Egypt is not a country that fights itself. It's not a country that would reach that point of say civil strife in that sense. However, the reality for the entire region is there is very much a pre-2011 world and a post-2011 world. And this idea that you can put these genies back in the box, that 2011 can be silenced and sort of suffocated forever, is just, it's a pipe dream. And Egypt, like a number of other countries, if you move across the region, we've had protests in Jordan, we have protests in Bahrain, we have protests in Syria, not just on the Palestinian issue. We've had long-running protests in Syria, for example. All of these different issues fester and it becomes a pressure cooker. And Egypt is currently a pressure cooker, has been. And, I've been warning since as early as 2016 that this was unsustainable. And I think, the US and others bought into this idea that this is a regime that can survive in this form with this level of repression for 30 years. And the reality is that that's not true. It's just not true. Just because Mubarak did it doesn't mean anyone who comes after him, considering how he was removed, can do it. And it also doesn't mean that you need 500,000 people to mass into Tahrir Square for that to become for that to put the regime under significant pressure and threat to change course. There are certain facts. This is a president who has never course corrected, will never course correct. And he just, that's not the way he does things. He doubles down. He does not give concessions. He continues to, even when his back is right up against the wall, which it is now. But, not that I sympathize with this regime, but they are currently in a crisis of their own making that is being sidelined for a crisis that is not of their own making, but actually could prove much more dangerous to them. And that is what's happening in Gaza. So it's like, okay, in the short term, in the immediate term, they get some respite with this war because the people support the military. The military are the protectors of the borders, and 1967 and 73. And, the fact that this happened the day after the October 6th and Yom Kippur War, yes, but in Egypt, it's celebrated as well as the 1973 war. And, when we had Egypt had the big military celebrations and then this all happened, this is a country that's very tied to that history. The military institution is their identity. It's very much tied up in the successes and, the Sinai and the Suez Canal crisis and things like this in modern times. And, this potentially really could become an existential crisis for Egypt's military regime. I don't believe the state, but certainly the regime. And nevertheless, that can still have a number of domino effects, because if we learn anything from 2011 is that nothing that happens in Egypt stays in Egypt, no matter what people might like to think. But it is a dangerous period for them. And you can sense it. I was in Cairo. I just got back 2 days ago, and it's like the Gaza stuff is like a thick fog that's like suffocating everyone. But at the same time, the regime fear is very palpable. You can hear it in their statements. You can see it in how visible the officials are being. Egyptian officials are not generally so visible out there every day talking to the public or issuing statements. So there is definitely a high level of fear.
We're almost out of time. We basically are out of time. So you'll just have to promise to come back on, because in some ways at the macro geostrategic level, I feel like what's happening in Ethiopia is arguably more important than any of the things that we just talked about. And, the civil war in Ethiopia, 600,000 dead is one of the estimates that I saw. One of the bloodiest conflicts we've had in decades.
We're talking one war or three? Well, because I think some people might.
Yeah, I know. It's all of the above, and maybe there's another one going on with the Amhara. And then you've also got this, last week there was some news, is Ethiopia thinking about military action against Eritrea because they want a Red Sea port. Abiy Ahmed comes out this week and says, no, we've never invaded anyone. We don't want that, which made me even more scared. So I don't know, take 3 minutes as the sort of cliffhanger for when we have you back on and just deal with Ethiopia.
Okay, let me wrap it up in a sentence and put myself out there. And, I may get lambasted for this, but I remember talking to colleagues and I wrote it in a Carnegie piece, which then got delayed because of the war. But when the war broke out, I said that Abiy doesn't politically survive this one way or another. He cannot, not just in terms of Tigray and an uncomfortable alliance with Eritrea versus the Tigrayans. And at what point is he going to have to cut his losses here to be able to make peace here? What does that do to his relationship with Asmara? The developments with the Amhara that are his constituency, is simply indicative of how existential this fight is in Ethiopia for, to quote an Ethiopian friend of mine, the soul of Addis. And this is much more than just constitutional autonomy. This is, the results of the Tigray war is a more vocal independence movement in Tigray. The fighting in Oromia, the fighting with the Amhara. It's all a story that is told through the lens of Abiy really allowing the state to crumble away. And this question actually of, and I know I've used the word existential a few times in this podcast, and maybe that's just a sign of the times that we're in, that everything is an existential battle. But I do think that, his continued leadership is a direct threat to the future of the Ethiopian state. And I said it 3 years ago about his staying power. He has stayed maybe a bit longer than I thought he would or could. But I do think one way or another, this is not something that he can politically emerge out unscathed. And if anything, that this quest to the sea and this march for sovereignty is sort of the last throw of the dice to rally some kind of nationalism, rally people around the flag, rally people around this idea of having, to quote, having taken the Nile, take the Red Sea. It's not a viable pathway to keeping the country as a whole, in that sense. You've got major social fractures and divisions, trying to start a war with neighbors, be it Eritrea, or insert themselves into the Somaliland, fractures, create more problems with Egypt, put Sudan at even more risk. It just seems very, very short-sighted. However, Abiy is playing all the cards that he can. There's rumors that he's arming RSF loyalists in eastern Sudan to be able to support a full RSF victory. We could see a protracted conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea play out in Sudan, considering the recent sort of détente reached between Afwerki and Burhan on the stability of the East and not having Eritrea get involved. So there are certain ways this could all play out. But I think not just agreeing with you about how important Ethiopia is, but also how intertwined the Sudan conflict and the Ethiopia conflicts actually are, and how much they play off one another and risk each other at the same time.
Well, yeah, and the confusing thing about Ethiopia is, all this violence, all of this instability, all the political, social cleavages that you talked about, all there, and yet they built the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Like they said last year, they wanted to no longer import wheat. They wanted to be a wheat exporter. I laughed at them. They did it amidst all of the chaos going on. So can you imagine if they had even some semblance of governance, the kind of impact they would have on the region?
I mean, it's ironic, really, because Abiy wasn't even that confident. That wasn't really that tied to the dam when he first came to power. And, there was a sense that Egypt really had an opportunity it squandered to get a decent deal, but that's for another story.
Yeah. All right. Well, Hafsa, thank you so much for your time, and you'll have to come back on. All right. Sounds good.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks a lot. Take care, Jacob. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.